welcome to our talk about women breaking barriers. We're delighted that you've joined us tonight to learn more about 4 remarkable women. And as we celebrate Women's History Month, it's a great opportunity to talk a bit more widely and a bit more in detail about the incredible women whose lives and whose deeds have so often been written out of the history books. And of course, all our panel members tonight, and I'm including myself here, we celebrate these often forgotten women all year round, as many of you probably know, in our books, in our fascinating podcasts, or on our blogs. So I just want to introduce myself. I'm not sure if you know me. My name is Cathie Dunn. I write historical fiction, mystery, and romance, and I'm a self-proclaimed history nut. I love it. My preferred eras are medieval Francia, the anarchy, which is very handy for tonight as well, and the Scottish Wars of Independence. I'm also a book promoter with the Coffee Pot Book Club. So if you're a keen reader of historical fiction, do pop over to our blog because you'll find some fantastic books there listed for your reading lists. Anyway, that's enough about me. If you have any questions at any point during the talk, please just add a note in the chat about it, but precede your question with 3 question marks or 3 Qs so we know exactly what it is and we can easily spot them. Thank you very much. And well, let's get started then. Please join me in extending a warm welcome to our lovely panelists, Paula Lofting, Sharon Bennett Connolly, and Samantha Wilcoxson. We'll be introducing 4 amazing women whose courage, intelligence, and actions, particularly given their circumstances at their times, were extraordinary. So first up, it's Paula talking about young Ethelfled, daughter of King Alfred the Great, if I'm right, who ruled under a lot of pressure. Paula Lofting's debut historical novel, Sons of the Wolf, was first published in 2012 and then revised and republished in 2016 with the sequel, The Wolf Banner. The third in the series, Wolfsbane, will be ready for publishing later this year. Very exciting. And in the midst of all this, Paula has acquired contracts for non-fiction books with prestigious pen and sword publishers. So her first one, Searching for the Last Anglo-Saxon King, Harold Godwinson, is due to be published in January 2025. And a biography of King Edmund Ironside is also in the pipeline. She has also written short essays about Edmund for Ian Dale's Kings and Queens, articles for historical magazines. When she's not writing, she is a psychiatric nurse, mother of 3 grown-up kids, and grandmother of 2, and also reenacts the Anglo-Saxon and Viking period with the awesome Regia Anglorum. Over to Paula.
Thank you. Thank you. I'm just wondering if Cathie could share the photograph or the image of portrayal of Lady Athelflaed I'll just credit the owner of the photograph, and the lady in the photograph itself is Jen Peters from Regia Anglorum. Yeah, so I'm going to talk about Athelflaed, Lady of the Mercians, daughter of Alfred the Great and wife of Athelred, Lord of Mercia. You'll have to forgive me if I stumble over all the Athel names, because when I'm most likely to get me Athelreds and me Athelflaids all mixed up, but I'll try to do my best not to. So, of those of us who are familiar with her story, who could not love this woman? She really broke down the barriers, achieving so much for her country, more than any male rulers had previously done. Ruling over Mercia, she accomplished what was previously thought only men could accomplish, surpassing any other woman in Anglo-Saxon England who had actually come before her. A woman leading troops into battle would have seemed impossible in the eyes of the people of her time. Although women had many rights and were well respected, the world in which she lived was still very much a man's world. She was loved by her people and men and women alike, the sort of ruler anyone would have been proud of. And yet she was hardly worth a mention in the Anglo-Saxon chronicles, except for the one known as the Mercian Register, and the Irish chronicles known as the Three Fragments, which also tells us more about her warlike inclinations. Asa, her father's biographer, describes the West Saxon milieu as one that did not promote female leadership. He didn't even mention the name of Athelflaed's mother, Elswith, in any of his writings, let alone refer to her as queen. But when Athelflaed's husband was too ill to take part in martial activities, neither he nor her brother Edward had any qualms in allowing her to take control of Mercia. This shows the strength of their trust for her. Despite Athelflaed carrying out the duties of a ruler, she was never titled queen, which was unusual for Mercia, for unlike Wessex, they did refer to the wife of their kings as queens. However, Athelred, from an ancient noble family, had emerged in a time when there was a vacuum of power in Mercia. After King Burgred had fled in the wake of the Danes, a man named Ceolwulf was set up by the Vikings, only to be disposed of not long after. For around 4 years, Mercia had no English ruler. Perhaps the treatment of the former kings put any Mercian contenders off. Eventually, with the support of Alfred and his fellow Mercians, Athelred agreed to lead them under the overlordship of Alfred, taking the humble title of Lord of Mercia rather than king. Therefore, his wife Athelflaed was titled Lafti, which meant lady. But hey, what's in a name? Asa may not have had much respect for Elswith to record her name, but he certainly recorded the names of her children. I shan't go into all of them, but let us just say that the Lady of Mercia had 2 full brothers, one of which was to become the king known as Edward the Elder. Alfred was to die in 899 and Elswith 3 years later. Athelflaed and Ethelred of Mercia were joined together in matrimony probably in around 886 to 887, when Alfred, having previously restored London, appointed Athelred as his governor. Their marriage may have been a part of the sealing of an alliance between Mercia and Wessex. Born around 870, this would have made Athelflaed around 16 years old at the time of their marriage. Mercia was now brought under the wing of Wessex management, and that's not to say that Athelred never acted independently in his own right, fighting his own battles in Mercia against the Welsh and the Danes. He was a tried and tested warrior. He was likely to have been 10 to 15 years or so older than his bride. Despite the age gap, though, they seem to have had much mutual respect for one another and worked really well together during their reign, or during Athelred's rule. Athelred appeared to have a close relationship with his father-in-law. He may have mentored Prince Edward for a short while when he was a young atheling, approaching the age when he was considered old enough to lead his own troops. Athelred also helped the young prince out when Edward had decided to besiege the Vikings on Thorney Island, whilst Alfred was fighting in the west and unable to help him. The 3 men seem to have had a workable alliance together against the Vikings during the 890s, pushing them back from the south. The Lord and Lady of Mercia were thought to have fostered Edward's firstborn son, Athelstan, whose mother was cast aside for Edward's second wife, Alfred. There was some controversy over Edward's union with Athelstan's mother, which may have not been sanctified by the church, leaving Athelstan and his sister Edgith as bastards. Athelstan and Edgith may have been a threat to his new wife's children and safer out of the way at the court of Auntie Athelflaed, where they might have been safer. She and Athelred were to have a child of their own, a daughter, Alfwyn, who was to rule for a very short period of time after her mother died in 918. William of Malmesbury, writing in the 12th century promoted the idea that Alfwyn's birth caused her mother extreme difficulty, so much so that she chose not to have any more children, and even went as far as rejecting her husband's advances. But there must have been, you know, other reasons why there could have been other reasons why she didn't have another child after Alfwyn. It wasn't necessarily that she had an extremely bad birth. Childbearing and rearing was not as easy for some others as in those days as it was for others, as we all know. Not long after his enthronement, Edward was to face a rebellion from his cousin Athelwold, son of Edward's uncle King Athelred I. He'd been passed over as king for his uncle Alfred after his father, King Athelred, had died, and he had just been a toddler. It was around this time that Athelflaed's husband became ill, and he does not appear to have been at Edward's side during his troubles with Athelwold. However, eventually, Athelwold died at the Battle of Holm in 902. Athelred was still not present with Edward when he invaded Northumbria or at the Battle of Tettenhall in 910. There is mention in the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle of the Burh of Chester being taken from the Vikings in 907, but it does not mention who led the victory. As Chester was in Mercian territory, it's likely the triumphant troops were Mercian, but Athelred is not said to have been the glorious victor. Could it be that the chronicler was being bloody-minded by not mentioning that a woman had led the troops? The Irish Chronicle, the three fragments, may hold the key to the truth, telling us that whilst Edward lay ailing, he was able to instruct his wife with strategic battle orders from his bedside, suggesting that it was she who was in command of this important win against the Vikings. At this time, no military campaigns were recorded by the Mercian Register between 902 and 911 that may have been attributed to Athelflaed. They only mention her by name when she is recorded having fortified a walled town named as Bremersburg. The English annals did not promote her as some sort of warrior woman, nor was she barely mentioned, though at this time it is clear that Athelred was out of action. Someone must have been acting for him, and the only reason I can think that she was barely mentioned, or that no one was actually mentioned as leading for him, was because the person leading Mercia was actually a female, and the scribes were not willing to have a woman doing what a man should have done. One of the earliest cases of censorship from the media. In the Irish and Welsh annals were less concerned by her being a woman and referred to her as queen. This can only be because they saw and respected her as a ruler. Athelred died in 911, and Edward, obviously busy with his own war against the invaders, did not make a move on Mercia for himself, allowing his sister to...
Paula, excuse me, you've got 1 more minute.
Oh, okay. So he allowed his sister to continue ruling with the consent of the Mercian nobles. Such was the respect and confidence he had in her ability. In conjunction with each other, they formed an alliance, working together on an impressive programme of fortification and battle to drive back the Vikings into the Danelaw between 912 and 915. From 916, we see Athelflaed become more on the offensive, and I'm going to miss out a little bit more of what I wanted to say about her to kind of move forward a little bit to 918, which was the last year, the year that she died, or the year before she died. The free fragment claims that when she was at the Battle of Corbridge, in which the Irish Norseman Ragnall participated against the Scots and the English Northumbrians, Athelflaed directed the battle with such ingenuity, she killed all the pagans so that her fame spread everywhere it seems, but in the English chronicles. This showed, however, that she was not only working with her brother against the invaders, but also had her own battles to fight. Henry of Huntingdon adored her. He wrote about her poetically. Athelflaed was to die not long after her amazing victory in 918, if we can believe the Irish annals, that it was her last battle. She was 48 when she died, in a time when life was often cut short by sudden illness. It seems she was at her most active when she was heading toward her last days. We don't know what she died of, but it's likely to have been some illness which may have meant she was dying of prolonged disease in the last years of her life, but still able to ride with her men as their leader into battle situations and command their respect and love. Let's face it, she was one heck of a woman. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Paula. I'll stop sharing the lovely chat. And yeah, what a remarkable lady she was. Amazing.
She definitely was.
Especially at the time where she lived,
Yeah.
she achieved quite a few things, even though not everyone wanted to write about. Yeah, I absolutely agree with that. She is remarkable. Right, next, I would like to introduce you to Sharon Bennett Connolly, who you probably all know, author of best-selling non-fiction about women through the ages. She's going to talk about two incredible women caught on opposite sides, and that's one of my favorite eras. She's talking about the two Matildas. Sharon Bennett Connolly is best-selling author of 6 non-fiction history books, including Heroines of the Medieval World, Silken Sword, and now Women of the Anarchy. A fellow of the Royal Historical Society, Sharon has studied history academically and just for fun, and even worked as a tour guide at a castle. Very exciting, I'm so envious. She also writes the popular history blog, historytheinterestingbits.com, and co-hosts the podcast A Slice of Medieval with historical fiction novelist Derek Burks. Sharon regularly gives talks on women's history. She's a feature writer for All About History and Living Medieval magazines, and her TV work includes Australian television's Who Do You Think You Are? I'm intrigued now. Sharon's latest book, Women of the Anarchy, in it she looks at the 19-year conflict with a focus on Empress Matilda and her cousin Matilda of Boulogne, King Stephen's queen. Sharon demonstrates how these women, unable to wield a sword, were prime movers in this time of conflict and lawlessness. She shows how their strengths, weaknesses, and personal ambitions swung the fortunes of war one way and then the other. Over to you, Sharon.
Thank you, Cathie. Let me just screen share, see if I can share screen. There we go. Right, let me just get back to the beginning. There we go. Right. Hello and good evening, everyone. Yes, today I'm cheating and talking about two women, Empress Matilda and Queen Matilda. And I'm going to concentrate on one particular year in the anarchy. And the year is 1141. And when I was researching the anarchy, I discovered it is called the War of the Two Matildas. The year 1141 has its own name, the War of the Two Matildas. And it got me thinking, because it's the only war I am aware of anywhere where women were leading the armies, the opposing armies at the same time. We've had Ethelfled, yes, she led an army, but she led an army against men, leading armies. Empress Matilda led one army and Queen Matilda led the other. And it came about because 1141 was quite a crucial year for the anarchy. The war had been going on in earnest for 3 years by this point. King Stephen was still on the throne. I'm not going to go into the whole background of how Stephen's on the throne and shouldn't be, but he really shouldn't be. It should have been Empress Matilda's throne. Stephen stole it, and now he's fighting to hold on to it. That's a summary of the years 1135 to 1141. So the year 1141 starts really well for the Empress. Stephen fights the Battle of Lincoln on the 2nd of February 1141, loses and gets captured by the Empress's army, which is led by her brother, Robert, Earl of Gloucester, the illegitimate son of Henry I and the most loyal supporter of Empress Matilda that she had. So he captures King Stephen. And at this point, Stephen's sent to the Empress at Nottingham, and I think it was Nottingham. I might be getting that mixed up with Henry III being at Nottingham in 1217. But anyway, Stephen's sent to the Empress. It happens. And then he's sent on to Bristol Castle to Earl Robert's wife, who becomes his jailer. Now, he's kept comfortably for a time until apparently he was found wandering in the castle grounds trying to find a way out, apparently. So he ends up getting clapped in irons in a dungeon. And personally, I think he deserved it. He stole the crown. Why shouldn't he be clapped in irons? But so with Stephen's capture, you have this point where Empress Matilda has won. She is suddenly in charge of England. And she must have thought, that's it, I've done it. Stephen's in prison, I've won. The problem was there wasn't this big flow of barons to the Empress's banner. She expected everybody to come running and say, okay, you've won, we give you your fealty, you're Queen of England. And it didn't happen. She gradually got more support, but not as much or in as fast a response as she expected. But she is still in command. She accepts the submission of those barons who do come to her. She holds a magnificent Easter court at Oxford. And the clergy even meet at, I think it was Winchester, under Henry of Blois, who is King Stephen's brother. Henry of Blois is Bishop of Winchester and papal legate to England. And he's one of those people who changes as often as the wind does. So Empress Matilda's in charge, and rather than defending his brother, Henry goes over to the Empress. And he is the one leading this convocation of all the clerics in England. And he proclaims, harking back to Ethelfled, you may notice, he proclaims Matilda as Lady of the English. He doesn't proclaim her queen, but he does proclaim her Lady of the English, which is probably at that time, it means that she's queen, basically. He uses Lady of the English because they used Lady of Mercia with Ethelfled. She was ruler of Mercia as Lady of Mercia, so they used the same connotation with Empress Matilda. So rather than naming her queen, probably also to avoid confusion with Matilda of Boulogne, they named her Lady of the English. Now, at this church meeting, Henry does receive a letter from Queen Matilda, Matilda of Boulogne, which tells the clergy and the barons that they've got to release Stephen and put him back on the throne. They ignore this letter. And everybody accepts that Empress Matilda is now in charge. Everybody except Queen Matilda. And as the months go on, she starts building an army in her base in Kent in order to challenge the Empress. But she also writes to the Empress to try and mediate. And she offers to persuade Stephen to abdicate and to take him into exile in Europe, or to persuade him to become a nun. Or she gives her all these ideas of what to become a nun. Sorry, to become a monk. You noticed. so yeah, she persuades Stephen to become a monk. But she asks the Empress for one thing. She asks the Empress to guarantee the inheritance of her son Eustace to the county of Boulogne and the honour of Eye and Stephen's county of Mortain. So she's not asking that the Empress see Eustace as Stephen's successor, but she is asking that he be allowed to inherit the family lands. And the Empress refuses. And at this point, she loses some of the support she's already got because the barons are up in arms. If she can disinherit Stephen's son, she can disinherit anyone's son. And there is this argument when you read books about the anarchy that this is, the Empress is changing the rules of inheritance, and that's why everybody hated her. And you look at it, and it's the irony and the hypocrisy and the fact that what all those barons had done in accepting Stephen's usurpation of the throne, they had effectively disinherited Empress Matilda and her own son, Henry of Anjou. And it's the fact that these barons are up in arms and not one of them realised that they're in arms about something they'd already done to Empress Matilda. But because she's a woman, she shouldn't do it to somebody else. So I am so on the Empress's side. She appears unreasonable, but all she's doing is what has been done to her. Now, unfortunately, this is a turning point for many barons. Some of them abandon the Empress and return to Matilda of Boulogn's side. She is with her mercenary commander, William of Ypres, in Kent, gathering her army. In the meantime, the Empress has made her way to Westminster to prepare for her ceremonial entry into London and then her coronation at Westminster Abbey. And I've just realised I'm doing what I always do. Right, so this was the Battle of Lincoln. This is why I shouldn't bother with PowerPoints. Right, well, so we've done Matilda of Boulogne. Right, so the Empress, my apologies, everyone. The Empress is now in Westminster, preparing for her coronation. She's already refused, unfortunately, she's also refused the City of London, its ancient rights, and said that they need to look into what these London's rights should be, whereas Matilda of Boulogne has guaranteed the City of London its usual ancient rights, which basically means the City of London is independent and can do whatever it wants. Of course, Queen Matilda can guarantee that because she can turn around later on and say, actually, my husband says I shouldn't have done that, so sorry. Whereas Empress Matilda is the one in charge, so she's there saying, no, I'm not going to just let you have what you want. The Londoners, unfortunately, decide that this isn't good enough. And they get a message to Matilda of Boulogne and say, come and help us. So on the night that the Empress is the eve of her official entry into London, she's sat in Westminster at dinner when the bells ring out in the city, which is the prearranged signal for the people of London to rise up against the Empress and her troops, and for Matilda of Boulogne, who's outside the City of London, to move closer and threaten the Empress.
Sharon, you've got 1 more minute.
Oh my Gideon, I'm as bad as Paula.
But take your time.
The Empress flees, leaving the food on the table uneaten, and she eventually makes her way to Winchester. Henry of Blois, Stephen's brother, uses this point to actually rejoin Matilda of Boulogne and say, right, I'm on my brother's side again. So the Empress goes to Winchester and besieges Henry's castle at Winchester. Now, this is the crucial time in the War of the Two Matildas, because Empress Matilda is besieging the castle at Winchester. And up behind her comes Queen Matilda to besiege the Empress. So we've got a siege within a siege. And suddenly the Empress is trapped, and the Matilda of Boulogne's army sets fire to Winchester. And the Empress's position becomes untenable. So she has to flee, and there's only one way, to the west. She flees west with her brother, the Earl of Gloucester, acting as vanguard to shield her from the army advancing on her. Unfortunately, Earl Robert gets captured. And suddenly we have this situation where the Empress's army has King Stephen, but Matilda of Boulogne's army has Earl Robert. And the rest of the year is taken up with working out an elaborate hostage exchange because nobody trusts anybody. And because of Robert getting captured, Stephen ends up back with his queen, Matilda of Boulogne, and has this magnificent ceremony at Canterbury Cathedral, a crown-wearing ceremony to show that he's back on the throne. And Empress Matilda is back where she was at the beginning of the year, no closer to the throne. But she's learned her lesson, I think, because by 1142, Henry of Anjou, her son, is brought to England. And it is Henry who the focus turns to, and we see Matilda taking a step back a little and focusing on Henry as the next heir to the throne, and showing everybody in England that it's Henry's right to his grandfather's throne, not Stephen's right to his uncle's throne. So I think it was 1141 was an important year for both Matildas. Matilda of Boulogne showed what she was made of, and that she was a strong, possibly stronger, in my opinion, than her husband Stephen, and that she knew how to get the job done. And Empress Matilda showed that she could rule England. She was the first woman to be named ruler of England. She was Lady of the English. But she also showed that her son was going to be King of England eventually. In 1154, when Henry gets crowned King of England, Empress Matilda wins the War of the Anarchy. There you go. Stop screen share. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Sharon. Yeah, I do agree on that year. It's a pivotal year for all involved. It's a fascinating year to study as well. It really is.
And I didn't even, when I started writing the book, I wasn't aware of how crucial a year it was. Because in the year after, Matilda's focus and policies change. And it's because she came this close. In that year, she came this close to that throne. And I just feel for her.
Yeah. It was just very, very tragic how she lost it and how she had to flee. We can only imagine the panic of having all these people gathered to catch you up. Anyway, if you haven't got it yet, I've got my copy, and I'll be sharing my review hopefully next month. I can't wait to get stuck into this one. Anyway, thanks very much, Sharon, for a really enlightening talk and presentation alongside it.
Apologies for that. I do that all the time. I just get carried away talking and then suddenly remember I've got a PowerPoint.
Thank you, but it looked very good from what we saw. It did indeed. Thank you. Anyway, moving on. Lastly, we do have Samantha Wilcoxson, and she is talking about one brave woman whose fight for her rights have really moved me deeply. And I think it's been 3 years since I read Luminous, the book about that particular woman, and I still well up every time I think about it, every time I think about this character, this poor woman, and her courage. Anyway, Samantha Wilcoxson is an author of historical fiction and non-fiction. Her novels vary in their setting, from the Wars of the Roses to the Great Depression, and her non-fiction focuses on America's early Republic era. Whatever the time period, Samantha passionately explores history and the personal sides of events. In her emotive writing, she urges the reader to truly experience what it might have felt like to live through a moment in history and connect with people of the past. When not reading or writing, Samantha enjoys traveling with her husband, as they do now. They especially enjoy exploring historic places, trying new foods, and spending time on the water. Samantha's most recently released novel, But One Life, tells the story of American patriot Nathan Hale. She's currently working on a biography of James Alexander Hamilton to be published by Pen and Sword History. Today, she's going to talk about Catherine Donahue, the protagonist of her novel Luminous. Highly recommended. Catherine was a real dial painter at Radium Dial in Ottawa, Illinois during the 1920s. When she and her co-workers began suffering from radium poisoning, Catherine's perseverance to hold their employer responsible and see legal protections put in place made a difference for women in the workplace everywhere, even if they sadly came too late for Catherine. So with that, over to Samantha.
All right, thank you. Let me see if I can do this screen sharing thing better than I did earlier. Hopefully this is going to show a full screen of the PowerPoint. Did that work?
Yes.
Okay, good. So as Cathie said, thank you for that. I'm going to talk about Catherine Donahue, who is the protagonist in my novel Luminous. And I didn't actually mean to change that yet. But as you can see from this first slide, her story is well documented in newspaper articles. So there was lots of historical information for me to use to tell her story. And it's tragic. It's not far from where I live. So it was actually a really interesting story to write compared to some of the other things that I've written about. It was easy for her to seem just really real. Catherine Donahue was 19 years old in 1922 when she started working at Radium Dial. This picture is not necessarily from Radium Dial. I've actually tried really hard to figure out if this picture was taken inside Radium Dial or there was a couple other places that were doing similar work, but it would have looked something like this. They had these big open airy rooms where the sunlight could come in so that the women could use radium infused paint to trace the dials and the numbers on watches and clocks. And this started during World War I because having these different instruments and clocks able to glow in the dark really helped during the war effort in World War I. And it continued on because after that, it of course just sort of became kind of this trend to have cool glow in the dark watches and clocks. And for the women working there, this was considered really great work. It was, you were paid by the dial, so you could make a lot of money. It was considered skilled work. It was considered, relatively easy compared to some of the other jobs that were open to working class women at the time. So when Catherine got this job, she thought she was just really hitting the jackpot. It was just the sort of thing that a girl like her wanted to get to be able to help contribute to her family or to save up for when she was married. So we, of course, know now that radium is dangerous and we don't use it day to day. But at the time, this screen kind of shows examples of why these women weren't concerned about working with radium. They were told it was good for their health. Early uses of radium were to reduce the size of cancerous tumors. And things like these were sold. That radium infused water got really popular among kind of the rich and famous, I guess you would say, until it started having negative effects on their health. And that got a lot more attention than the effects on the health of the women working in places like Radium Dial. But ads like this one, where radium was expected to extend life to 100 years. Like when radium was first discovered, it was just expected to have all these wonderful health benefits because it kind of seemed like it did at first, until it didn't. And as we know, it's very dangerous, and studies since then have shown that humans should be, not exposed at all to radium. At the time, they thought that it was actually good for them. So the reason I'm showing you the high school in Ottawa is because this is actually the building after it was decommissioned as a high school. This is the building that Radium Dial was in. It no longer exists today. So that's why this kind of vintage looking postcard is the picture I have of it. These big windows made it the perfect building for Radium Dial to take over and to use for their painting studio. And after they stopped using this building, unfortunately, the building was razed and the construction debris was used as fill all around town. So all of that radioactive material was spread around even more. And to this day, Ottawa, Illinois has an EPA Superfund site there. They're still working on cleaning up radioactive material around the area. For Catherine and her friends working there in the 1920s, when they started experiencing health problems, they really didn't know what was going on. No one knew radium poisoning was even a thing, and they weren't experiencing the same symptoms. So that made it even more difficult for the people who maybe a doctor even believed that it might be related to their work. It was really hard to explain why some women were infertile, some had joint pain, some grew different kinds of cancers. A lot of them, because of the way they would point the brush bristles with their mouth, a lot of them, their teeth started falling out and their jaws started disintegrating. So all of those different symptoms made it really challenging for the people who thought radium was good for them to say, oh, wait, maybe it's actually causing all these awful things to happen. So it wasn't necessarily, at least always, the case that the radium industry was, just trying to take advantage. But of course, eventually the radium industry did realize that it was dangerous and they were not telling these women. So this larger picture here, that is Catherine Donahue at one of the hearings she went to, and she's also in the middle of the 3 pictures. Her first symptom was pain in her hips. She thought she had arthritis. She started growing a big tumor on the side of her hip, and so she was just really not sure what was happening. As you can see, she lost a lot of weight. What radium does in their bodies is it becomes part of their bones. It takes the place of calcium, is how your body absorbs it. So she just kept really disintegrating from the inside out. By the time of the hearing at the Illinois Industrial Commission, she weighed less than 70 pounds. So, but she was just really determined at this point. She's in her early 30s. She was just really determined that even though she saw her health failing to an extent, that it at one point became clear to her that she was not going to survive this. She wanted to make sure other people didn't go through the same thing that she was and that her friends were going through. So she was just very determined to testify against radium dial in court. And they did that with the help of this guy here. Among all these women are some of the other women from Radium Dial. Catherine is signing a contract with Leonard Grossman. He's the lawyer who took on their case pro bono, because all these women were struggling during the Great Depression. They all had medical bills, and he just saw this case and said, someone needs to deal with this. This isn't right what these women are going through. So he's the one who took on their case. And as you can see already at this point, Catherine is very, very tiny, and she just kept getting smaller. Her teeth started falling out. When she testified at this hearing, she gave the judge a little box that had pieces of her teeth and her jaw that were falling out as evidence. This is a picture of Catherine with her 2 children shortly before she passed away. She's 35 years old and she passes away, and she has these 2 small children who actually later in their life, they also experienced health problems, which were either because of her exposure, her failing health while she was pregnant, or because of the radium. It's really hard to know at this point, but this is a picture that was in the paper of them. So at that last hearing, Catherine's final testimony was actually given in her home. She was bedridden. As I said, she weighed less than 70 pounds at this point. She's been going through lots of experimental treatments trying to treat this radium poisoning, and has finally had to accept that her condition is fatal. But she perseveres. She wants to testify so much that they take the hearing to her home. That's Leonard Grossman by her side, and some of the other women. You can actually see Charlotte Purcell kind of behind her with her sleeve empty, because Charlotte had to have her arm amputated because of radium poisoning. Excuse me. So they do this final part of the hearing at her home so that she can still testify. And in this one newspaper clipping, you can see it's a poignant moment when Leonard Grossman has her demonstrate how they would point the tips of the brush with their lips, because that's the way the girls were taught to do it. And that's how they were introducing radium into their body every day, all day long. And that's why Catherine was dying, and why the other women there experienced different health problems of their own. They did win this case. The judge ruled, it was the Illinois Industrial Commission that ruled on this case, and they ruled in favor of Catherine and the other women. Unfortunately, Radium Dial in the interim had closed up its doors, moved all its assets over to a completely different company a few blocks away called Luminous Processes, doing the exact same thing with all of the assets of Radium Dial, and a lot of times employing the same people. So when they won this case, there was almost no assets for the judge to award to these women and their families. And Radium Dial also appealed anyway, because they just didn't want that legal precedent. And it went all the way to the Supreme Court. Leonard Grossman followed that case all the way to the Supreme Court for free. And when the Supreme Court refused to hear the appeal is when the case was finally won for these women. By that time, Catherine had passed away. The one article here is a picture from her funeral. That's Pearl Payne kneeling in front of her casket. since there was no assets, or not many assets left of radium dials, Tom, Catherine's husband, got about $5,000, which did not cover Catherine's medical expenses. They had to take out 2 mortgages on their house. So, but on the bright side, what Catherine really wanted to do is win protections for women so that they wouldn't go through this in the future. And eventually, the radium industry was slowly but surely regulated, and workmen's compensation covers all sorts of things now that in Catherine's time it did not cover. So that did happen, and part of it was thanks to this group of women in a little Midwestern town who never wanted anything other than to earn a little bit of money to help their families out. They certainly didn't expect to be in all these newspaper articles, and sadly did not expect to pass away when they were only 35 years old. So this picture, this is Catherine's little modest grave in Ottawa, Illinois, and Tom's, her husband's, is actually one of those flat stones kind of behind hers. He never remarried. He died about 20 years later. And this other picture is actually a monument that was put up in 2011. And it's not any particular one of the women. It's not actually Catherine Donahue, but it's meant to symbolize all of those women who worked at Radium Dial in Ottawa. And kind of a neat story behind this is that the girl who pushed for this monument to be put up and helped raise the money for it was a high schooler. So she knew this history of their little town, and she pushed for this to happen. And so there is this monument there now, recognize what these women went through and their legal battle that they went through. So, and I got a warning, so hopefully that means I'm still about within my time.
You're just out, but I didn't want to disturb
Okay.
it towards the end, but
all right, so
Continue.
yeah, and this is
Continue.
Oh, yeah. All I was going to say is that if you noticed in the newspaper articles, Catherine was wearing a polka dot dress a lot of times when she went to court. So that's when I had this cover designed. I wanted to have Catherine's polka dot dress on there.
Fabulous. Thank you so much for this rather talk. It's harrowing to hear Catherine's story, and also to read about the other women and how they suffered and how they literally disintegrated during their young lives. They should be out, you know, having fun, and then reality strikes, really, literally. And your talk and the images, I think they help visualize it as well, and they help us getting to know them. So thank you very much, Samantha. Thank you. Right, that's all we have for everyone tonight. Do you have any questions? Then feel free to ask them. If not, I have a few. So if you don't have any, then I'll just ask mine. And my first question, the questions are for every one, is that what brought the woman you were speaking about to your attention? And shall we start with Samantha?
Sure.
To your attention?
Yeah, so it was reading Kate Moore's book, Radium Girls, which I listened to it on audiobook, because that's how if I want to like read a book but don't want to spend the time reading it, it's like, oh, I find it interesting, so I kind of want to at least listen. I listened to it and I was just astonished, like it just keeps getting worse and worse and worse. And so then I bought a copy of it and I read it, and I just, okay, I have to write about one of these women. And Catherine was the one that I felt the strongest connection to. Just I could put myself in her place, you know, so easily. She just wanted to be a wife and a mom, you know. So yeah, that was how I came across her story.
Brilliant, thank you. And Paula, how about you and Ethelflaed? Yeah, you need to unmute yourself.
Yeah. I years ago, I can remember my dad talking about the Lady of the Mercians, and had always kind of like, you know, stuck in my head that there was this woman that you know, led an army and that kind of thing. And I didn't really sort of, you know, focus in on her until a bit later when I you know, started getting more into the Anglo-Saxons and that period of time, and I had this like idea all the time that I wanted to write, you know, about her, but I started writing about Harold instead, or that particular era, the 1066 era in head, but I always had it in my mind to want to kind of, you know, get into Athelflaed a bit more, and you know, the whole story of her family, really, which is quite a remarkable story. When I did the I did a little piece for the Historical Times magazine, and about the family at war kind of thing. And I was just amazed at the story, you know, of you just imagine them going from one bird to another building, and you know, driving back the Danes, and just an incredible story. But the fact that Athelflaed was a woman was the thing that kind of, like, you know, draw her to me. And how, you know, how did that happen? How did this woman actually get to do, you know, why did Athelred, her husband, pick her to you know, why did he feel so comfortable, and why did he choose her to lead in his place? And yeah, and we still don't really know, but you know, we can, you know, if you read between the lines of history, you can very much often pick up the little sort of nuances of the time, you know, nuances in the story that gives you the idea. Well, she must have been a remarkable woman, and she was the daughter of Alfred, after all, who was you know, he was great, wasn't he, as well? So but yeah.
Brilliant,
Yeah,
thank you.
it comes from a while back.
That's great. Thank you very much, Paula. And Sharon, which Matilda caught your eye first?
Well, I think it's always been the Empress. Ever since I was a child, it was the Empress Matilda was hard done by. But then when I was writing Defenders of the Norman Crown, the biography of the Warren family, I discovered they were on the side of King Stephen. And it's the one thing I don't like about the Warrens. Because it's like, how dare they be on the side of King Stephen? So that's what got me into the idea of looking at the anarchy and the different women, because in that book I discovered that when I was researching the Warren book, I discovered that it was Matilda of Boulogne who negotiated the treaty with the Scots in 1139 and arranged the marriage of Ada de Warren with the heir to the Scottish throne, Prince Henry. And I suddenly realized that it wasn't a war of Stephen against Matilda. It was Stephen and Matilda of Boulogne against Empress Matilda. And the idea for the women of the anarchy was that to write the Empress Matilda story without the misogyny, and to write Matilda of Boulogne's story, because however Empress Matilda is badly misrepresented in history, Matilda of Boulogne tends to get totally overlooked. And nobody realizes how much of a significant contribution she made to the anarchy. If it wasn't for her, Stephen would have been imprisoned on the 2nd of February 1141 and stayed there. You know, Queen Matilda was the one who was continued the fight. And it's interesting that at the end, in 1153, when Stephen makes the deal with Henry of Anjou, that he would adopt Henry and make him his heir, Matilda of Boulogne's dead. She died in 1152. So Stephen doesn't make the deal until after Matilda of Boulogne's dead. And you do get the feeling that if she'd still been alive, she would never have allowed Stephen to disinherit his younger son. So Stephen's weaker because she's not there. So that was the reasoning behind it, to actually show Empress Matilda in the good light, and to show Matilda of Boulogne and show how significant her contribution was to Stephen's throne.
That makes much sense to me. Absolutely. Thank you, Sharon. My next question is, how do you think her life would have panned out had circumstances be different? And I'd like Paula to start this time.
Well, if she hadn't have become, if she hadn't married Ethelred, or it all depends on. I don't know. It's really difficult because you'd have to think about what aspect of her life would have been different. And I know this might be cheating a little bit, but if I think about the book that was written by Annie Whitehead, To Be a Queen, in her book, it's fiction, but she has Athelflaed fall in love with Ethelred's friend, Aldhelm, and she thought she was going to be marrying him rather than Ethelred. And I guess that if Alfred had married her to one of the other Mercian nobles, and things could have turned out really different. But I have trouble seeing him do that, because he had to make a marriage with the guy who was going to lead Mercia, so it had to be Ethelred, really. I suppose also, if she hadn't been a stronger woman, perhaps that that she'd just gone on to have lots more children and just sort of stayed in the background, because I think that could be part of the reason why she was able to be such, to focus on more about ruling rather than just being the mother of the the heir kind of thing. That she didn't have as much, she only had the one child. Whether she had others that she lost, or that they died in infancy, I don't know. But perhaps if she if she'd had more children, she may not have been the strong ruler that she became, and he may have chosen one of his more trusted companions to have ruled or to have led for him while he was ill. And it's an very interesting question, because it makes you think about things that you wouldn't normally think about. I wouldn't have thought about that if you hadn't asked me. So brilliant question, really. And one that's more plausible, I guess, than her marrying somebody else. But yeah.
True. Okay, thank you, Paula. Sharon?
Well, in an ideal world, Empress Matilda would have been Queen of England, wouldn't she, in 1135? So that's the one that I look at straight away. She would be Queen of England in 1135. She would have ruled possibly until her son Henry was old enough to rule for himself, possibly for the rest of her life. I don't know. I think she probably would have retired eventually. She did. Later in life, she retired to the Abbey of Bec, and I think she probably would have done that even if she had been declared queen, and just lived a contemplative life once Henry was married to Eleanor of Aquitaine and old enough to rule. Matilda of Boulogne would therefore have stayed being Matilda of Boulogne with Stephen as her husband, and we would not know anything about how strong and capable she was as a ruler and a leader of men. So I suppose in the grand scheme of things, actually, the way it panned out, we get to see Empress Matilda's abilities. We get to see the opposition to Empress Matilda because she was a woman. And we get to see Matilda of Boulogne's capabilities. But in an ideal world, it would have been Empress Matilda becoming Queen of England in her own right, and us having our first female ruler 300 years before we actually did, 400 years before we actually did. And maybe that would have changed history forever, because maybe nobody would have been bothered about female rulers, which means that Henry VIII would have stayed with Catherine of Aragon. We wouldn't have had Edward VI. We wouldn't have had Elizabeth I. Mary Tudor, Mary I would have got married young, had children, and we would still probably have the Tudors on the throne and be still a Catholic nation. So who knows?
These what if scenarios are very interesting because you can really go off on different tangents as well. Yeah. Thank you,
I
Sharon.
was wondering if I could ask Sharon a question about,
Mhm.
do you think that if Matilda had you know, been queen, had won the Civil War and was queen in her own right, what would she have had to have done with Stephen? Do you think she would have had to have executed him?
I don't think she would have executed him. I don't think the barons would have accepted execution. I think she may have done what some people say happened with Edward II and given him into papal custody, something like that, or kept him in prison until he died. But yeah, I don't think she would. He was a crowned and anointed king, and in those days, the fact that he'd been anointed meant that he couldn't not be king. Which was one of the major problems with naming Empress Matilda queen, because they had a king. He was anointed, as far as they were concerned, he was anointed by God, and he was given the job by God. So even though he acquired it under false pretenses. So yeah,
I think he would have William the Conqueror, did it?
Yeah. Yeah.
Thank you anyway.
Interesting aspect. Well, Samantha, your turn at
oh, well, yeah.
how her life would have panned out if circumstances had been different.
Right. If circumstances had been what Catherine had planned, we wouldn't be talking about her at all. She would have married Tom and had children and had her family and, you know, just lived a normal little small town life and
lived till she was 100, remember?
yeah, maybe. But I mean, you know, it's as tragic as her story is, the fact that she persevered, I don't want to say accepted her circumstances, because it's not like she had a choice. I mean, she did have a huge breakdown in court when her doctor testified that she only had months to live, and she had kind of been trying to tell herself that something was going to work, something was going to cure her. And when her doctor finally testified, she collapsed. And it was, I mean, it was a huge real moment that really happened, you know, and I include it in the novel as well. But because, you know, to her, like, even though she had seemed so strong and she was doing all this, she still kind of did have that hope that things were going to turn out differently. Would she have, I mean, would anyone who ends up in a situation like that have willingly sacrificed themselves if they knew that, oh, all these laws are going to change and other people will be protected, or they'll at least be compensated when things happen? I mean, we don't know, right? Because people do those things because they're forced into those situations. They don't choose them.
Yeah. And as you say, we would never have heard of Catherine Donahue had this not been the case, which would have been maybe good for her. But it may have changed a lot of things if that changed afterwards in terms of working practices and all that. So we never know. My last question to you is, if you could travel back in time, you could give your lady, one word of advice, what would it be? Starting with Sharon this time.
I think it would be, as much as I would hate to do it because I don't think it's right, it would be to say to Empress Matilda, you have to emphasize that you're fighting for your son and that it's your son's throne you're fighting for. And I hate to say it because she had every right to that throne, but in those days, they wouldn't give it to a woman. They didn't want a woman ruling them. They didn't want a woman leading armies. So it should have been, you have to say, this is for Henry, and that you want to hold the throne for your son. And as soon as he is old enough, you will give it back.
Yeah, sadly has to be. Yeah, that may have changed a lot as well, because the nobles may have rallied behind him.
Yeah.
Who knows? Thank you very much.
If she'd brought Henry over in 1138, although he was only 5 years old, if she'd brought him over with her, at that point, I
Showing
think
off.
it would have been a different story.
Yeah, I think you have a point there. Yeah, Samantha.
Well, since I feel like I can't just go back and tell Catherine, you know, don't take a job at Radium Dial. I guess what I would say is don't be so trusting, because the women put off for years pressing their case in court. The women, Catherine wasn't the first young woman to pass away in Ottawa, and they were given they were told they were dying of diphtheria or syphilis, or, you know, it just didn't even make any sense. And they kept going to work there, and they knew they were getting sick. And I mean, they're in their 20s. There's no reason for all these women to be getting sick, but their employer kept saying, you know, oh no, you're fine. And even when there was another case in New Jersey where women were bringing forward a similar case a little earlier, they were told, oh no, that's a completely different compound than what you're using. And they trusted that. They believed them again and again. Even as women were dying, they believed what they were told. So I guess I would just go back and say, you know what, don't trust them just because they're men, just because they're the boss, just because they write your paycheck, you know.
Or just because they're doctors, as we know. Yeah, thank you. That makes sense. Paula, what advice would you give to Ethel?
I'm similar to Sharon, really. If I was to, give her any advice, maybe something went wrong with the transfer of power over to Alfwin, because she did, I think it was a few months. Some sources say 2 months, I think, but it could have been about 6 months. But something went wrong with that, and I don't know. You know, it's very difficult to work out what that was. We can all sort of kind of like conjecture a lot of reasons why that went wrong. But maybe to have, I don't know, done something more legally with Edward, perhaps, to kind of, because, you know, Alfwin was I mean, it might have been that Alfwin wasn't her mother, you know, wasn't her mother's daughter, really, in the sense that she wasn't strong enough to, you know, hold on to that claim. But the problem is with these things that I see, you know, we see it with the Stephen and Matilda, that you know, the conflict that came with that whole, you know, thing. People, you know, and in the middle of it all, the ordinary person was the one suffering, you know, because their lands were always being like raised and everything, you know, and this is the problem when there's a dispute over a succession all the time, isn't it? Yeah. But I suppose that would have been probably my only thing, perhaps, to have made sure that the succession for Alfwin was, you know, done properly. Yep. Something went wrong.
Absolutely. Thank you very much, Paula. Well, any final questions for our panelists? Oh, Ron, yeah, please.
Sorry. Yeah, just a really quick one for Samantha. At what point, you said that the Radium Dial company shut up shop, but they moved and just changed their name. At what point did they realize that radium was really dangerous and they stopped making radium clocks?
So it's actually kind of crazy, because the new company was called Luminous Processes. And basically what they did after Catherine's case was they just stopped having the women lip point their brushes. They used glass pens dipped in paint instead, and they literally kept using radium paint until it was made illegal, I think in the 70s. It was much, much later. So yeah, it's sad. It's crazy. That's why I say when I was reading Kate Moore's book, you keep reading this stuff and it keeps getting later and later, and you're like, really, this was still happening? How is that even possible? But yeah, they kept doing it until they were told they legally couldn't.
Wow.
Yeah.
Scary, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
That's really scary. Well, Thank you very much. If that's all of the questions, then we can conclude tonight and give a big thanks to Samantha Wilcoxson, Sharon Bennett Connolly, and Paula Lofting for their fascinating talks about 4 remarkable women. I'm sure we can all agree that they were incredibly courageous, brave, and, well, yeah, we talk about
Women.
them. So they're still with us. They're still there and they play a role. So well done, ladies. And thank you very much.